The red sun of Zerion 7 beat down on the desert planet like an angry fist. Heat waves danced across the endless sand dunes, making the ancient stone ruins in the distance look like they were moving. Dr. Sarah Chen wiped sweat from her forehead and looked at the alien landscape that would be her home for the next 6 months. She was not alone. 3 other scientists stood nearby, each one very different from her and from each other. This was the most important archaeological dig in the galaxy, and each major species had sent their best expert. Dr. Zethkar was the expedition leader. He came from the Veltari people, and his skin looked like living crystal that caught the light and threw it back in rainbow colors. The crystal skin was not just beautiful, it helped his people survive in hot places by bouncing heat away from their bodies. Zethkar was tall and proud, and he moved with the confidence of someone who had never failed at anything important. Engineer Quilnox represented the Insectoid Federation. She looked like a giant praying mantis, but her mind was sharp as a razor. Her dark green shell was harder than steel, and she could work in places that would kill other species. The insectoids were famous across the galaxy for building things that lasted forever. Quilnox clicked her mandibles when she thought, which she did constantly. Navigator Femshaw was the strangest of all. She came from an ocean world, and her blue-gray skin needed to stay wet or she would die. She wore a special suit that sprayed mist on her constantly, making her look like she was always walking through a light rain. Her people were the best in the galaxy at reading landscapes and finding hidden things. Then there was Sarah. She was human, which meant she was the odd one out. Humans were new to the galactic community. Most aliens thought of them as the soft species. No natural armor, no special skin, no built-in tools. Just pink skin that burned in the sun and minds that seemed to worry about everything. The 4 scientists had come to Zerion 7 because deep under the sand were ruins from a civilization that had disappeared 1,000,000 years ago. The ruins might hold secrets about faster-than-light travel, or new energy sources, or weapons that could change the balance of power in the galaxy. Every major species wanted to be the one to find those secrets. "We will establish base camp here," Zethkar announced, pointing to a flat area near some large rocks. "The ruins are 2 kilometers to the east. We will begin excavation tomorrow." The alien scientists nodded and immediately began setting up their shelters. Sarah watched with interest. As each one used their natural abilities, Zethkar raised his arms toward the sun. His crystal skin began to glow and he started singing in a high, pure voice. The sound made the sand around him vibrate and move. Slowly, crystals began to grow from the ground. They twisted and curved, forming walls and a roof that looked like frozen music. The crystal shelter was beautiful and would stay cool even in the worst heat. Quilnox did not waste time with singing or ceremonies. She simply began digging. Her powerful arms moved faster than human eyes could follow, throwing sand in perfect arcs. Within an hour, she had dug a complex tunnel system under the ground. Her shelter would be completely protected from heat, wind, and sand. Femshaw worked differently. She opened several containers and poured thick green liquid on the ground. The liquid began to bubble and grow, forming a dome-shaped shelter that looked like it was alive. Tubes and passages grew from it, recycling air and water. It was like a living thing that would take care of her needs automatically. Sarah looked at their amazing shelters, then at the pile of building materials she had brought. She had metal sheets, stone blocks, insulation foam, and a dozen different tools. Compared to the others, her supplies looked primitive and clunky. "Dr. Chen," Zethkar called out, his voice carrying a hint of amusement. "Do you need assistance with your construction?" "No, thank you," Sarah replied politely. "I have everything I need." She began to work. First, she cleared and leveled a large area of ground, much larger than seemed necessary for one person. Then she started laying foundation stones in careful patterns. The other scientists stopped their own work to watch. Sarah's building process was slow and methodical. She measured everything twice, checked angles with instruments, and wrote notes in a small book. She built thick walls using both stone blocks and metal sheets, with gaps between them filled with insulation. It did not look elegant or beautiful like the crystal structure. It did not look efficient like the underground tunnels. It certainly did not look alive and adaptive like the biodome. "Fascinating," Quilnox clicked to Femshaw. "The human appears to be constructing a primitive box." Femshaw made a sound like water gurgling, which was how her people laughed. "Perhaps it is a cultural requirement. Some species have rituals that make no logical sense." Zethkar watched Sarah install what looked like 2 separate doors with a small room between them. Dr. Chen, why do you need an airlock? The atmosphere here is perfectly breathable. Sarah paused in her work. It's not for the atmosphere. It's for other things. What other things? Zethkar asked. But Sarah had already gone back to work. As the days passed, Sarah's shelter grew stranger and stranger. She built walls that were much thicker than necessary. She installed ventilation systems that seemed to go nowhere. She created internal rooms that appeared to serve no purpose. Most puzzling of all, she kept reinforcing things that were already strong enough. The other scientists began to whisper among themselves. During meals, they would glance at Sarah's construction and shake their heads. The poor creature, Femsha, said one evening as they shared rations. Her species lacks the evolutionary advantages we take for granted. She is trying to compensate with excess. Quillnox clicked in agreement. Inefficient use of materials and energy, a classic sign of primitive engineering. Zethkar was more direct. Dr. Chen, I must express concern about your shelter design. It appears to be overbuilt for local conditions. Our environmental sensors show that simple protection from sun and sand is sufficient. You are expending far too much effort on unnecessary features. Sarah looked up from her work. She had been installing metal reinforcement bars in the walls, even though the structure was already solid. I appreciate your concern, Dr. Zethkar, but humans have different needs. What needs could possibly require such robust construction? He asked. Sarah was quiet for a moment. She looked out at the desert, then at the clear sky, then back at her half-finished shelter. We prepare for things that might happen, she said finally. The aliens exchanged looks. Zethkar's crystal skin flickered with colors that meant confusion and mild contempt. Dr. Chen, we have the most advanced environmental monitoring systems in the galaxy. If any danger threatened us, we would know about it well in advance. Of course, Sarah said. She went back to work. That night, as the others rested in their perfect shelters, Sarah worked by artificial light. She was installing systems that made no sense to anyone watching. Backup power supplies for the backup power supplies. Water storage tanks hidden in the walls. Food lockers sealed with multiple locks. Air filters connected to air filters connected to more air filters. Zethkar could not sleep. The sound of Sarah's construction kept him awake. But more than that, he was puzzled. Humans were supposed to be intelligent. They had built starships and joined the galactic community. But this shelter made no sense at all. He stepped outside his crystal home and walked over to where Sarah was working. She was installing thick metal shutters over windows that already had thick metal shutters. Dr. Chen, he said gently, perhaps you are suffering from adaptation stress. Being so far from your home world can affect judgment. Would you like me to contact the medical team? Sarah looked at him with tired eyes. I'm fine, Dr. Zethkar. Really. I like to be prepared. Prepared for what? Sarah looked out at the dark desert. The wind was completely calm. The sky was clear. The temperature was perfect. Everything was peaceful. For whatever comes, she said. The work at the dig site was going well. Each day the team uncovered more pieces of the ancient civilization. Strange metal objects that hummed with unknown energy. Stone tablets covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly. Devices that seemed to bend light around themselves. But the real entertainment for Zethkar, Quillnox, and Femsha was watching Sarah work on her shelter during breaks. After 2 weeks, the structure had grown into something that defied all logic. It was a blocky, ugly building that looked like it was designed to survive a war. The walls were so thick that the inside rooms were much smaller than they needed to be. She had installed metal blast shutters on every opening. The roof was layered with different materials that served no obvious purpose. Look at this, Quillnox said during lunch, pointing one of her blade-like arms at Sarah's construction. She has built 3 separate power systems. 3. My shelter uses one efficient geothermal tap and has never had any problems. Femsha's biodome had grown beautiful flowering vines that cleaned the air and provided fresh fruit. She picked a sweet purple berry and ate it while watching Sarah install yet another backup battery system. My home maintains itself perfectly. It adapts to changing conditions automatically. Why would anyone need so many manual systems? Zethkar's crystal shelter was now a work of art. It had grown new rooms as he needed them, and the walls showed beautiful patterns of light during sunset. He was proud of his construction, and he could not understand why Sarah seemed to be building a fortress instead of a home. Dr. Chen, he called out, as Sarah wrestled with a heavy piece of equipment. What is that device? Sarah wiped grease from her hands. It's an atmospheric processor. It can clean and recycle air even if the outside environment becomes problematic. Problematic how? Quillnox clicked. The atmosphere here is perfectly stable. Our sensors monitor it constantly. Well, you never know, Sarah said. The aliens looked at each other. This was becoming a pattern. Every time they asked Sarah why she needed some piece of equipment, she would give a vague answer about unknown problems or unexpected situations. Zethkar decided to be more direct. Dr. Chen, I think we need to discuss your construction project. As expedition leader, I'm concerned that you're wasting valuable resources on unnecessary preparations. Sarah stopped working and looked at him. Wasting resources? Yes. You've used enough materials to build shelters for 10 people. You've installed systems that we don't need. You're spending time on preparations for problems that don't exist. His crystal skin flickered with colors that meant authority and mild irritation. Our species have evolved sophisticated ways to deal with environmental challenges. We don't need to build bunkers. The word bunkers hung in the air. That was exactly what Sarah's shelter looked like, a military bunker designed to protect against attacks. I'm not building for attacks, Sarah said quietly. Then what are you building for? Femsha asked. Her voice was gentle, but there was curiosity and concern in it. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. She looked at their shelters, beautiful, efficient, perfectly adapted to the current conditions. Then she looked at her own thick-walled, over-engineered structure. My species has a saying, she said finally. Hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. That seems like a very anxious way to live, Quillnox observed. Maybe. But we're still alive. That evening, the alien scientists sat together in Zethkar's crystal shelter. The walls were transparent, so they could see the stars and the peaceful desert. Femsha's biodome glowed softly in the distance, and Quillnox's tunnel entrance was marked by neat piles of excavated sand. Sarah's shelter sat among them like a dark, heavy block. Light leaked from small, heavily protected windows. The sound of machinery hummed from inside as she worked on yet another system. I think the human is suffering from paranoid delusions, Zethkar said. Her species is new to space travel. Perhaps the stress of being on an alien world is affecting her mind. Femsha made a gurgling sound of agreement. My people have studied human psychology. They are naturally anxious creatures. They see danger everywhere, even when none exists. Quillnox clicked her mandibles thoughtfully. The human brain is designed for surviving on a dangerous world, but they apply that same fearful thinking to safe situations. It is inefficient. They began placing bets on when Sarah would give up on her fortress-like shelter. Zethkar thought she would abandon it within a month when the work became too exhausting. Femsha believed Sarah would realize her mistake when her overcomplicated system started breaking down. Quillnox calculated that the structure was so inefficient it would become unlivable within 6 weeks. None of them noticed that Sarah had stopped joining them for evening meals. She was too busy working. While they relaxed in their comfortable, perfectly designed shelters, Sarah was deep in her bunker-like building, surrounded by screens showing weather data, seismic readings, and atmospheric pressure measurements. She had tapped into the expedition's sensor network and was collecting information that the others didn't think was important. The planet's weather patterns were strange. Most of the time, Zerion 7 was perfectly calm, but there were gaps in the historical data. Periods where the automated weather stations went silent for days or weeks at a time. The gaps happened regularly, about every 30 to 40 local years. Sarah pulled up geological surveys of the planet. There were signs of massive erosion events. Entire mountain ranges had been worn down to nothing. Rock formations showed evidence of incredibly powerful winds carrying sand and debris at tremendous speeds. She found old explorer reports buried in database archives. Most were routine surveys, but a few mentioned extreme weather anomalies and temporary atmospheric disturbances. One report, filed 57 years ago, mentioned a planetary-scale sandstorm system, but gave no details. Sarah did the math. If the weather events happened every 30 to 40 years and the last recorded one was 57 years ago then, she worked faster. During the day, she pretended to focus on the archaeological dig. She made the required discoveries, took the necessary notes, and participated in team meetings. But every spare moment was spent on her shelter. She installed air scrubbers that could handle toxic particles. She built water storage systems that could last for months. She created food storage areas with multiple preservation methods. She reinforced the structure to handle impacts and pressure changes that her instruments suggested were possible. The other scientists continued to mock her efforts, but their jokes were getting sharper. Dr. Chen has built herself a tomb, Quillnox said one morning as they watched Sarah install what looked like blast doors. Perhaps that's what humans do when they're afraid, Femsha suggested. They hide in boxes and hope the universe doesn't notice them. Zethkar was less amused and more concerned. I'm going to recommend that Dr. Chen be recalled to her homeworld for psychological evaluation. This behavior is becoming disruptive to team morale. That afternoon, he confronted Sarah directly. Dr. Chen, your construction project has gone far beyond reasonable preparation. You're building as if you expect this planet to try to kill us all. Sarah looked up from the atmospheric sensor she was calibrating. Dr. Zethkar, has your species ever experienced a planetary-scale natural disaster? The question caught him off guard. We evolved in stable crystal cave systems. Our environment has been consistent for millions of years. What about you, Quillnox? Femsha? Quillnox clicked in confusion. My people live underground. Surface weather is irrelevant to us. Femsha gurgled thoughtfully. My world has ocean storms, but they are predictable. We simply dive deeper when they come. Sarah nodded slowly. Each of your species evolved in stable environments. You developed amazing abilities to thrive in those environments. But what happens when the environment changes suddenly? Our sensors would warn us of any significant changes, Zethkar said firmly. Your sensors are designed to detect the kinds of changes your species understands, Sarah replied. What if something happens that you've never experienced before? The three aliens looked at each other. This was exactly the kind of paranoid thinking they had been discussing. Dr. Chen, Zethkar said patiently, we have the most advanced environmental monitoring equipment in the galaxy. We can predict weather patterns months in advance. If there was any real danger, we would know about it. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then she asked, have any of your species ever lived through an ice age? What's an ice age? Femsha asked. A period when the planet's temperature drops drastically and stays low for thousands of years. Most life dies. The survivors have to completely change how they live. The aliens stared at her. This sounded like science fiction. My world has had several ice ages, Sarah continued. We've also had supervolcano eruptions that blocked out the sun for years, asteroid impacts that killed most living things, massive floods that reshaped continents, climate changes that turned forests into deserts overnight. She gestured toward her thick-walled shelter. Humans learned that no matter how safe things seem, the universe can always surprise you. We learned to build for the worst case, not the best case. Zethkar's crystal skin flickered with colors that meant dismissal and superiority. Dr. Chen, your world was obviously unstable. 3 weeks into the expedition, the instrument started showing strange readings. Sarah noticed it first. She was checking the atmospheric data during her morning routine when she saw something that made her blood run cold. The barometric pressure was dropping, but not in a normal weather pattern. It was dropping in a way that reminded her of something from Earth's history, the kind of pressure drop that happened before massive storm systems. She pulled up more data. Wind patterns in the upper atmosphere were shifting. Temperature gradients were changing. Seismic sensors were picking up vibrations that didn't match any known geological activity. Sarah ran to the main camp where the others were having breakfast. We need to look at these readings, she said, her voice tight with concern. Zethkar looked at the data pad she handed him. His crystal skin shifted through colors as he processed the information. Atmospheric pressure variations, completely normal for a desert planet. Look at the pattern, Sarah insisted. And the timeline. These changes are accelerating. Quillnox took the pad and studied it with her compound eyes. I see minor fluctuations in air pressure and temperature. Nothing that would concern our environmental systems. Femsha examined the data through her moisture suit's display. The readings are within normal parameters for planetary weather systems. Sarah felt frustration building in her chest. You're not seeing the big picture. Look at how all these changes are connected. The pressure drop, the temperature shifts, the seismic activity. They're all part of the same system. Dr. Chen, Zethkar said with the patience he might show to a child, you must understand that we have sophisticated environmental analysis programs. If these readings indicated actual danger, our computers would have flagged them immediately. Sarah stared at him. Your computers are programmed based on your species' experiences. They look for the kinds of dangers your people understand, and, What kind of danger do you think we're facing that our advanced systems cannot detect? Quillnox asked. Sarah took a deep breath. A planetary-scale sandstorm. The three aliens stared at her. Then Femsha made the gurgling sound that meant she was trying not to laugh. Dr. Chen, Zethkar said gently, sandstorms are local weather events. They affect small areas for short periods of time. The concept of a planetary-scale sandstorm is not scientifically possible. It is on this planet, Sarah said firmly. I've been studying the geological evidence. This world has massive storm systems that happen every few decades. They can cover entire continents. Quillnox clicked her mandibles dismissively. If such storms existed, they would be well documented. Our survey data shows no evidence of extreme weather patterns. Sarah pulled up more information on her pad. That's because your survey teams were here during calm periods. But look at the erosion patterns. Look at the rock formations. This planet gets scoured by wind and sand on a regular basis. She showed them images of the landscape. Smooth, rounded hills that looked like they had been carved by wind. Valleys that were perfectly symmetrical, as if shaped by flowing sand. Rock formations that were polished to mirror brightness. Natural, geological processes, Zethkar said, formed over millions of years. Formed by storms, Sarah corrected. Look at the layering in the sediment deposits. These formations were created by repeated exposure to high-velocity particulate bombardment. The aliens looked at her with expressions that clearly said they thought she was losing her mind. Dr. Chen, Femsha said carefully, perhaps you should rest. The stress of being off-world for extended periods can cause imaginative thinking. Sarah wanted to scream. Instead, she pulled up the historical data she had been collecting. The automated weather stations on this planet go silent every 30 to 40 years. Always for the same duration, about one local week. That's not equipment failure. That's the storms destroying the stations. Quillnox examined the data. Equipment failures are common on frontier worlds. The gaps in data could be caused by any number of technical problems. All at the same time, following a regular pattern, and always preceded by the same atmospheric changes we're seeing now. Zethkar's crystal skin flickered with colors that meant he was getting annoyed. Dr. Chen, I understand that your species has a tendency toward catastrophic thinking, but we cannot base our decisions on paranoid speculation. Sarah felt something snap inside her. Paranoid speculation? My species survived ice ages, volcanic winters, asteroid impacts, and plague outbreaks that killed 90% of all life on our planet. We learned to read the signs of disaster because the ones who didn't read them died. She pointed at each of them in turn. Your people evolved in stable crystal caves where the environment never changed. Your people live underground where surface weather doesn't matter. Your people live in oceans where you can just dive deeper when things get rough. None of you have ever had to deal with the kind of catastrophic environmental change that can wipe out entire civilizations. The aliens stared at her. This was the most emotional they had ever seen the human. Dr. Chen, Zethkar said slowly, even if such storms were theoretically possible, our shelters are designed to handle any reasonable environmental challenge. Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. Reasonable environmental challenge, that's exactly the problem. You're all thinking about reasonable challenges, but nature doesn't care what's reasonable. She turned to leave, then stopped. I'm going to ask you one more time to look at the data. Really look at it. Not through your computers, not through your assumptions about what's possible, but with fresh eyes. Because if I'm right, we have maybe 48 hours before this planet tries to kill us all. After Sarah left, the three aliens sat in uncomfortable silence. She's clearly having some sort of breakdown, Femsha said finally. Quillnox clicked. Agreement. The human mind is fragile. Too much stress and they begin seeing patterns that don't exist. Zethkar was thoughtful. Perhaps we should review her data more carefully. Not because I believe her theories, but to put her mind at ease. They spent the next hour going through Sarah's information. The atmospheric data showed variations, but nothing outside normal parameters. The geological evidence could be interpreted many ways. The historical gaps in weather station data were easily explained by equipment failures. There's nothing here that suggests immediate danger, Quillnox concluded. Agreed, Femsha said. The human is seeing threats where none exist. But Zethkar was still studying the data. Something was bothering him, though he couldn't put his finger on what it was. Meanwhile, Sarah was in her shelter, working frantically. She had given up trying to convince the others. Instead, She was focused on final preparations. She sealed all the gaps in her walls with expanding foam. She double-checked every air filter and backup system. She moved her most essential supplies to the most protected inner room. She tested and retested the communications equipment. Most importantly, she activated the external sensors she had been secretly installing around the camp. If the storm was coming, she would see it first. The readings from her sensors were getting worse by the hour. Atmospheric pressure was dropping faster now. The wind patterns in the upper atmosphere were forming the spiral shapes that meant massive, rotational systems were developing. Seismic activity was increasing as the planet's crust responded to atmospheric pressure changes. Sarah had seen patterns like this in Earth's historical data, right before the great storms that had shaped human evolution, right before the environmental disasters that had taught her species that the universe was not a safe place. She opened a communication channel to the expedition's emergency frequency. All team members, this is Dr. Chen. I am implementing emergency protocols. Recommend immediate shelter preparation for extreme weather event. Zethkar's voice came back, calm and slightly annoyed. Dr. Chen, we have discussed this. Our environmental systems show no indication of dangerous weather. Dr. Zethkar, please check your seismic readings. Cross-reference with atmospheric pressure data. Look for patterns. There was a pause. Then Quilnox's voice. Dr. Chen, seismic readings show minor ground vibrations consistent with thermal expansion. No cause for concern. Sarah looked at her own seismic data. The vibrations weren't from thermal expansion. They were from something much bigger. Atmospheric pressure waves caused by massive air movements in the planet's upper atmosphere. Team, I am reading pressure waves that indicate major atmospheric disturbance approaching. Recommend all personnel move to hardened shelters immediately. Femshaw's voice, patient but condescending. Dr. Chen, your instruments may be malfunctioning. Our readings show stable conditions. Sarah stared at her displays. According to her sensors, the storm system was massive, covering half the planet and growing. According to the official expedition sensors, everything was fine. She realized what was happening. The expedition's sensors were designed by species that had never experienced planetary-scale disasters. They were programmed to recognize the kinds of environmental changes that mattered to crystal dwellers, tunnel builders, and ocean swimmers, but they weren't programmed to recognize the signs of the kind of storm that could strip the surface of a planet bare. Sarah made one last transmission. All team members, major storm system approaching in approximately 6 hours. It started with a sound like distant thunder. Zethkar was in his crystal shelter, reviewing the day's archaeological findings when he heard it. A low rumble that seemed to come from everywhere at once. His crystal walls began to vibrate gently, creating a musical humming sound. Interesting, he said to himself. Seismic activity. But when he checked his instruments, they showed no earthquake activity. The sound was coming from the sky. Outside, the horizon had changed. What had been clear blue sky was now a wall of brown darkness stretching from ground to upper atmosphere. It looked like a mountain range, but mountains don't move, and this wall was moving fast. Quilnox emerged from her tunnel system, her compound eyes reflecting confusion. She had felt vibrations through the ground, but they weren't the kind her people knew. These vibrations came from above, not below. What is that? She clicked, pointing at the approaching wall of darkness. Femshaw's biodome was already reacting to atmospheric changes. The living walls were turning darker colors and starting to pull inward, following programming that told them to protect against environmental stress. But the dome had never encountered anything like this before. Its biological systems were confused, sending contradictory signals. Zethkar stepped outside his crystal shelter and looked at the approaching storm with scientific curiosity rather than fear. It appears to be a large sandstorm. Unfortunate but not dangerous. Our shelters are designed to handle such events. The wall of sand was now close enough that they could see details. It wasn't just sand, it was rocks, debris, and what looked like pieces of metal spinning in the air. The storm was tall enough that its top disappeared into the upper atmosphere. It stretched across the horizon in both directions as far as they could see. How big is this storm? Femshaw asked, her voice tight with growing concern. Quilnox was checking her instruments frantically. My sensors are showing. This cannot be correct. The storm system appears to cover several thousand square kilometers. That's impossible, Zethkar said. Sandstorms are local weather events. The rumbling sound was getting louder. It no longer sounded like distant thunder. It sounded like a freight train the size of a continent, bearing down on them at incredible speed. That's when they heard Sarah's voice on the emergency communicator. All team members, immediate emergency shelter available at human construction. Follow the guide lights. You have approximately 10 minutes. Zethkar looked at his beautiful crystal shelter, then at the approaching wall of destruction. 10 minutes until what? His answer came in the form of the first wind gust. It hit them like a physical blow, strong enough to knock Femshaw off her feet. Sand and small rocks pelted them like bullets. Impossible, Quillnox clicked, but her voice was lost in the growing wind noise. The guide lights Sarah had mentioned began blinking, a trail of bright emergency beacons leading from each of their shelters to her ugly, overbuilt bunker. Another wind gust, stronger this time. Zethkar's crystal shelter began to sing as the wind played across its surfaces, but it was not the beautiful music it usually made. This was a harsh, discordant sound that meant stress and damage. Perhaps we should consider Dr. Chen's offer, Femshaw said, her words barely audible over the wind. Zethkar was about to reply when the real storm hit. The wall of sand slammed into them like a solid object. Visibility dropped to 0 instantly. The wind went from strong gusts to a constant screaming force that made it impossible to stand upright. Sand filled the air so thickly that breathing became difficult. Zethkar tried to reach his crystal shelter, but he couldn't see it anymore. The guide lights were still visible, strobing through the sand like beacons in a fog. He grabbed Femshaw's arm and began following the lights toward Sarah's bunker. Behind them, they heard the sound of crystal breaking. Zethkar's beautiful shelter was designed to handle heat and reflect light, but it was not designed to withstand impact from rocks traveling at 200 kilometers per hour. The first large debris struck the crystal walls and sent cracks spreading through the entire structure. More impacts followed, and the mathematical precision of the crystal formations began to collapse into jagged fragments. Quillnox had made it back to her tunnel entrance when the storm hit. She dove underground, confident that her deep shelter would protect her from any surface weather. But as she descended into her carefully engineered tunnels, sand began pouring in behind her. The storm was too powerful for her tunnel design. Sand was being forced into the entrance faster than it could be filtered out. The tunnels that were supposed to be her perfect protection were filling up like water containers. Quillnox tried to go deeper, but the sand followed her. Her compound eyes, designed for seeing in darkness, were useless when filled with grit. Her breathing holes were clogging. She realized with growing terror that she was being buried alive in her own shelter. Above ground, Femshaw was struggling toward the guide lights when her biodome began to collapse. The living walls that were supposed to adapt to environmental changes had never encountered anything like this storm. The biological systems went into shock and began shutting down. The dome that had provided perfect climate control was now being shredded by wind and sand. The beautiful vines that had given fresh fruit were being stripped away. The complex life support systems that recycled air and water were failing as sand clogged the delicate biological filters. Femshaw's moisture suit was being damaged by flying debris. If it failed completely, she would die in minutes as her amphibian skin dried out. The 3 alien scientists fought their way through the storm, following Sarah's guide lights. The lights were bright enough to see even through the thick sand, and they were positioned perfectly to guide people from each shelter to the human bunker. Sarah had planned for this. When they finally reached her shelter, they found the outer door standing open with Sarah waiting for them. She was wearing what looked like a full environmental suit with air recycling and protection from debris. "Quickly," she shouted over the storm noise. "Through the airlock." One by one, they stumbled through the double door system that Sarah had built. As soon as all 3 were inside the small intermediate chamber, Sarah sealed the outer door and activated an air cleaning system. Powerful fans sucked the sand-filled air out of the airlock and replaced it with clean, breathable atmosphere. Then, she opened the inner door, and they entered her shelter. Inside, it was quiet. The thick walls that the aliens had mocked as over-engineering were now protecting them from the storm outside. The sound of wind and flying debris was reduced to a distant rumble. The air was clean and properly pressurized. Emergency lighting provided steady illumination. But most shocking of all, the shelter felt solid and stable. While their own shelters were being destroyed outside, Sarah's ugly bunker wasn't even shaking. "How?" Zethkar asked, his crystal skin flickering with colors that meant confusion and awe. Sarah was checking readings on multiple displays. The walls have multiple layers with air gaps between them. They're designed to absorb and dissipate kinetic energy rather than resist it directly. The foundation goes down 4 meters and is anchored to bedrock. Quillnox was covered in sand and breathing heavily, My tunnel doors, they're filling with sand. How did you know to build above ground? Tunnels are death traps in sandstorms, Sarah replied matter-of-factly. Sand flows like liquid under pressure. It finds every opening and fills every space. Femshaw's moisture suit was damaged, but Sarah had anticipated this too. She handed the amphibian scientist a replacement unit from her equipment storage. I stocked medical supplies for all species types, she said. Outside, the storm raged with impossible fury. The wind speed had reached over 300 kilometers per hour. Rocks the size of human heads were being hurled through the air like missiles. Sand was moving in waves 20 meters high, reshaping the entire landscape. Zethkar looked through one of the small, heavily protected windows. Where his crystal shelter had been, there was now only empty desert. The storm had completely erased it. How long will this last, he asked. Sarah checked her instruments. Based on the atmospheric readings, approximately 72 hours. 3 days. They would be trapped in this bunker for 3 days while the storm scoured the planet's surface clean. Quillnox clicked her mandibles in distress. 72 hours? My shelter? All my equipment? Your equipment is gone, Sarah said gently. All of our surface installations are gone. The only things that will survive this storm are underground facilities built specifically for this kind of event. She gestured around the shelter's interior. This is designed to be completely self-sufficient for up to 2 weeks. We have air, recycling, water reclamation, food storage, power generation, waste processing, and emergency medical facilities. Femsha looked around the shelter with new eyes. Every system had backups. Every critical component was protected by multiple layers of redundancy. The shelter that had looked like paranoid over-engineering was revealed as careful preparation for exactly this situation. You knew this was coming, Zethkar said. It wasn't a question. Sarah nodded. The signs were all there. You just had to know how to read them. Outside, the storm howled like a living thing, reshaping the world with unimaginable violence. The storm lasted exactly 73 hours and 42 minutes. Sarah had predicted 72 hours, but she was not upset about being wrong. As she explained to her companions, it was always better to overestimate the duration of a disaster than to underestimate it. During those 3 days and nights, the 4 scientists experienced the full fury of what Sarah called a planetary resurfacing event. Through the shelter's protected windows, they watched the landscape outside change completely. Sand dunes that had been there for thousands of years were erased and rebuilt in new locations. Rock formations were carved into different shapes. Even the ancient ruins they had come to study were partially buried under new deposits of sand and debris. But inside the shelter they were comfortable and safe. Zethkar spent most of the first day examining Sarah's construction with the scientist's eye. He found himself amazed by the simple elegance of her approach. Where his crystal shelter had tried to resist the storm's force, Sarah's design absorbed and redirected that force. The walls are not solid, he observed, running his hands along the interior surface. They have spaces between layers, Sarah nodded. 3 separate walls with air gaps. When debris hits the outer wall, the energy is absorbed by the airspace and dissipated before it reaches the inner layers. It's the same principle we use in spacecraft hull design. Quillnox was studying the air recycling system. As an engineer, she was impressed by its redundant design. You have 3 complete air processing systems. Why so many? Because if one fails during a storm like this, we all die, Sarah replied simply. The same reason I have 3 power systems, 3 water processors, and 3 waste recycling units. Redundancy equals survival. Femsha was most interested in the food storage systems. Sarah had stockpiled enough supplies for 4 people for 2 weeks, with meals designed for each species' dietary needs. You prepared food for us before you even knew we would need shelter, she observed. I hoped I was wrong about the storm, Sarah said. But if I was right, I knew I couldn't save myself and let my colleagues die. Humans are social creatures. We survive together or not at all. On the second day, when the storm was at its worst, the shelter's communication equipment picked up automated distress signals from across the planet. Other research stations, mining operations, and survey teams were being hit by the same storm system. Most of their emergency transmissions cut off after a few hours as their equipment was destroyed. The storm really is planet-wide, Zethkar said, studying the signal data. How is that possible? Sarah pulled up atmospheric models on her computer. Xerion 7 has an unusual orbital pattern. Every 37 years it passes through a debris field left over from an ancient asteroid belt. The debris interacts with the planet's atmosphere and triggers these massive storm systems. She showed them satellite images from previous storm events, grainy photos that showed the entire planet covered in swirling brown clouds of sand and debris. Our advanced survey teams were lucky, she continued. They arrived during calm periods between storms, but the signs were there if you knew how to look for them. Quillnox clicked her mandibles thoughtfully. Our sensors were designed to detect the kinds of environmental hazards our species evolved to fear: underground collapses, toxic gases, seismic instability. And mine were designed for ocean hazards, Femshaw added. Pressure changes, temperature variations, chemical imbalances in water. Zethkar's crystal skin flickered with colors of understanding. My people's sensors look for crystalline stress patterns, heat buildup, and structural resonance failures. None of us were looking for this. He gestured toward the window where sand was still blowing past in sheets so thick they looked like solid walls. Humans evolved on a world that tried to kill us in every possible way, Sarah explained. Ice, ages, volcanoes, earthquakes, floods, droughts, plagues, asteroid impacts. We learned to recognize the early warning signs of catastrophic change because the ones who couldn't recognize them didn't survive to pass on their genes. On the third day, as the storm finally began to weaken, Sarah shared more of her people's history. She told them about civilizations that had risen and fallen due to climate change, cities buried by volcanic ash, entire species wiped out by environmental disasters that happened faster than evolution could adapt. That's why we over-engineer everything, she said. Why we prepare for disasters that seem impossible. Why we always assume the worst-case scenario. Because we've learned that the universe doesn't care about our assumptions. Zethkar found himself thinking about his homeworld. His people lived in crystal cave cities that had been stable for millions of years. They had never needed to worry about sudden environmental changes. Their evolution had favored specialization over adaptability. What would happen to my people if our environment changed suddenly? He asked. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Honestly, most of them would probably die. Specialized species are amazing at surviving in their specific environments, but they're vulnerable when those environments change. Quillnox made a sound of distress. My people are the same. We've optimized for underground living for so long that we can barely survive on the surface. And mine have never lived anywhere but in water, Femshaw added. Even with technological assistance, we struggle in dry environments. Sarah looked at each of them. But that's not necessarily a weakness. Your species developed incredible abilities by specializing. You can do things humans could never do. The problem comes when you assume your environment will never change. When the storm finally ended, the world outside was completely transformed. The shelter's external cameras showed a landscape that looked nothing like what they remembered. New hills had formed where flat desert had been before. The ancient ruins were partially buried, but new structures had been uncovered in other locations. More importantly, their original shelters were gone. Zethkar's crystal formation had been reduced to scattered fragments. Quillnox's tunnel system was completely filled with sand. Femshaw's biodome had been stripped down to its roots. All of our equipment, Quillnox said sadly. Our research data, our samples, our personal belongings. Sarah activated the shelter's external scanning systems. Actually, I think some things survived. Look at this. On the display, they could see metal objects buried under the new sand deposits. Sarah had installed emergency beacons on all their critical equipment before the storm hit. The beacons were still transmitting, which meant at least some of their gear had made it through the disaster. You protected our equipment too? Zethkar asked. I tried to protect everything I could, Sarah replied. It's what humans do. Over the next few days, as they carefully excavated their buried equipment, the three alien scientists began to understand what human engineering really meant. Sarah had not just saved their lives, she had preserved their mission. The archaeological samples they had collected were stored in protective containers that had survived the storm. Their computer data had been backed up in hardened storage systems. Even their personal belongings had been moved to protected locations before the storm hit. You did all this without telling us, Femshaw observed. I hoped I was wrong about the storm, Sarah said again. If I had been wrong, you would have just thought I was being paranoid. If I was right, then at least we would all survive. As they worked to re-establish their base camp, the alien scientists found themselves copying Sarah's building techniques. They built thicker walls, installed redundant systems, and prepared for problems that seemed unlikely but were theoretically possible. Zethkar's new shelter was still made of crystal, but now it had multiple layers and flexible joints that could handle impact stress. Quilnox designed her tunnels with multiple entrances and sand-resistant seals. Femshaw's biodome included backup systems that could function even if the biological components failed. "We're building like humans now," Quilnox observed one evening as they shared dinner in Sarah's shelter, which had become their unofficial meeting place. "You're building for survival," Sarah corrected. "Every intelligent species has to learn these lessons eventually. Some learn them through experience like humans did. Others learn them through education, like you're doing now." Zethkar's crystal skin showed colors of deep thought. "Our species have been exploring the galaxy for thousands of years, but we've only visited worlds that were similar to our home environments. We've been unconsciously selecting for places where our natural advantages would work. What happens when we encounter a world that doesn't fit our expectations?" Femsha asked. Sarah smiled. "That's when you call humans. We specialize in surviving in places that aren't supposed to be survivable." The expedition's final report changed galactic architecture forever. Sarah's shelter design was studied by engineers from dozens of species. Her paranoid over-engineering became the standard for frontier construction. Her disaster preparation protocols were adopted by exploration teams across the galaxy. But more than that, the report changed how alien species thought about environmental adaptation. They began to understand that specialization, while powerful, could also be a vulnerability. They started including generalist perspectives in their planning, looking for problems that their specialized viewpoints might miss.